My name is Malcolm Dwyer. After 22 loyal years, I was blindsided, fired without a word, replaced by the CEO's daughter on her first day. They erased me like I was never there. I felt humiliated, disposable, like my life's work meant nothing. But I didn't beg. I walked away, head high, dignity intact. Sometimes silence isn't grace. It's surrender. And I refused to disappear quietly. Listen to the whole story. How I found the strength to stand up, speak out, and choose self-respect over silence. Then tell me, did I make the right call walking out? Would you have stayed? Drop your thoughts below. I need to hear from people who've stood in shoes like mine. I still remember that Monday morning. Cloudy, not quite rainy, but nowhere near bright. The sky had that washed-out gray hue, like someone had taken the color out of everything. Even the hum of the office felt quieter than usual, as if the building itself knew something I didn't. The carpet in the hallway had just been cleaned over the weekend, but it still held the scent of too much detergent. I walked past the break room, nodding out of habit to a couple of younger analysts. They didn't nod back. One of them quickly looked away like he'd been caught staring. It didn't feel like a normal day. It felt like the kind of morning that arrives with its hands behind its back, like it's hiding something. Around 8:14, the internal email hit. Leadership transition announcement. Nothing too surprising at first glance. Sloan Dynamics had been talking about change for over a year. Mr. Sloan, founder, visionary, and to some of us, almost a father figure, had been quietly stepping back, spending more time at his cabin in Idaho. But when I opened the message and saw her name, I felt my gut drop just a little. Kendry Sloan has been appointed Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. I read that line twice. It wasn't the promotion that surprised me. Everyone knew she was being groomed for it. It was the timing, the way it came so abruptly. No introduction, no transition period, just a flat, cold announcement. The rest of the email was dressed in the usual corporate spin: strategic evolution, visionary leadership, next-generation innovation. But the phrase that stuck with me was near the end, and we are excited to redefine the culture and direction of Sloanwell for the future. Redefine. That word sat on my tongue like metal. I leaned back in my chair, trying to ignore the weight settling in my chest. I'd been with the company 22 years. I wasn't looking for recognition or a statue in the lobby. I just thought maybe I'd get to finish what I helped start. I glanced out the window at the commuter traffic on 8th Street. The same flow of cars, same misty skyline. Everything outside looked the same. But inside, something had already shifted. I thought about her father. We'd worked side by side in the early years, back when we were shipping monitors out of a rented warehouse in Columbia, Missouri. He trusted me. He listened. He once said, "You're not just my operations guy, you're the reason this place runs on rails instead of wishes." I remembered the day he asked me to pray for him, quietly behind closed doors during a product recall crisis. We didn't make a show of it. Just a brief moment of stillness. A simple, desperate kind of faith that stuck with me more than the actual solution we came up with. At 10:30 sharp, my phone buzzed. Meeting, CEO introduction, floor 6, 10:45 a.m. It wasn't a group meeting. It was just my name on the invite. The elevator ride felt slower than usual, even though I was alone. When the doors opened, the 6th floor looked different. The waiting area had been redecorated, sleek chairs, glass walls, minimalist artwork. It was all very clean, very modern, and very cold. A young assistant with a clipboard nodded at me. "She'll see you now." Kendry Sloan was already seated behind the desk that used to belong to her father. She didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't even pretend this was anything but a transaction. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Thanks for coming up." I sat down slowly, careful not to let my coat wrinkle against the arms of the seat. She tapped something on her tablet, then folded her hands like she was about to give a TED Talk. "We're moving in a different direction," she said plainly. "And frankly, we don't need legacy roles slowing us down." It hit harder than I thought it would. The words weren't sharp, they were sterile. That's what made them cut deeper. I opened my mouth, then closed it. What was I supposed to say? That I wasn't a legacy role? That I'd been here before she knew how to spell logistics. That I'd stayed late, come in early, held this place together with duct tape and prayer when it mattered most. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I nodded. Just once. She slid a folder across the desk. Your transition file. IT will deactivate your account by end of day. I picked up the folder with both hands, partly because they were shaking and I didn't want her to see. She looked past me, already glancing at her calendar on the screen behind me. So I stood up. No handshake. No thank you. Just that quiet hum of a room where someone thinks they've done something brave, when really, they've just made a decision they don't yet understand. The walk back down the hallway was longer than it should have been. As I reached the elevator, I realized my grip on the folder was so tight, the corners had bent. I let out a breath. I didn't know I was holding. And as the doors closed, I still didn't know what hurt more. The words she said, or the way no one looked up as I walked out. When I got back to my floor, something felt off. Not loud, not obvious, just slightly shifted. Like a picture frame tilted half an inch. My badge still worked, but the scanner took longer than usual. As I stepped through the glass doors, I noticed my nameplate was gone. I paused for a second. Maybe someone knocked it off. Maybe janitorial moved it for cleaning. I didn't think too much of it until I reached my desk. Someone else was sitting there. A younger guy, mid-30s, maybe, looked up at me with panic in his eyes, like he'd just walked into the wrong restroom. Oh, Mr. Dwyer, right? I thought you were moving to logistics. I blinked. Logistics? He pointed behind him awkwardly. They said your setup got transferred down 2 floors. I figured IT had cleared it already. I didn't respond. Not right away. I just stared at the empty space where my mug used to sit, the ceramic one with the Sloanwell logo, chipped near the handle.
Gone.
So was the photo of me and my daughter at the company picnic 5 years ago. I wondered where they'd gone, whether someone had thrown them out or just boxed them up without thinking. I turned around and walked without a word. People noticed me, sure, but no one said anything. That was the part that stung the most. The silence. Downstairs, in what used to be a supply room and was now labeled Logistics Reorg Pod B, there was a small desk with a broken drawer and no monitor. No nameplate. No phone. Just a sticky note that read Temp, Dwyer. I stood there for a while, then left. I didn't even log in. By 10 a.m., I was at Riverlight Beans, a cafe 2 blocks down from the office. I used to meet clients here in the early days, back when Sloanwell still needed handshakes more than headlines. The barista still remembered my name. That counted for something. I picked a table near the window, sipped coffee that tasted slightly over-roasted, and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking. Then I saw him. Elias Tran walked through the door like he'd been waiting outside for the right moment. He spotted me right away, gave a small wave, and sat across from me without asking. You look like someone just told you your dog ran away with your pension, he said. I cracked half a smile. Close enough. He didn't press for details. Just nodded slowly and waited. They moved me. I finally said. Didn't tell me. Just reassigned my desk. Someone else was already sitting in it. Elias let out a soft whistle. Let me guess. Kendry? Didn't say a word herself. Let the floor plan speak for her. He leaned back, arms folded. That's not a real plan, Malcolm. That's a razor with better lighting. I looked down at my coffee. You think I should have pushed back? He tilted his head.
No.
I think you should have seen it coming. And I think you're smart enough to know it wasn't about logistics. There was a long pause. The kind only old friends can sit through without discomfort. I stayed too long, I murmured. Elias gave a dry chuckle. You and me both. I glanced at him. You were different. You left on your own. He nodded.
True.
But not before they tried the same trick on me. Cut me out of planning calls. Reassigned junior staff. Made my role feel like a title with no territory. Why didn't you fight it? He met my eyes. Because I realized something. I thought if I kept quiet, if I didn't make waves, they'd respect my loyalty. Instead, they treated my silence like agreement. I swallowed. That one landed. Elias leaned in a little. You know what I figured out, Mal? They don't keep roots when they plan to replant the whole damn tree. They keep the pot clean, toss the dirt, and start fresh. We sat for a minute, letting that sink in. Then he added, quietly, they offered me a consulting gig 3 weeks after I left. Full pay.
Perks.
But I turned it down. I raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I'm not trading my self-respect for a shiny badge. I earned the right to walk out with my head up. I wasn't about to crawl back just so they could feel better about replacing me. His words hit harder than I expected. There was no bitterness in his voice, just clarity, like someone who had already bled, healed, and now carried the scar like a quiet badge of survival. He glanced at his watch. You'll need to decide soon. Decide what? Whether you're willing to fade slowly, or leave before they finish pretending you never mattered. I didn't answer right away. Just sat there, hands wrapped around a paper cup, watching the light shift through the window. Outside, the clouds had started to break. A little sun found its way in. I showed up that morning like I always did, 30 minutes early, black coffee in hand, ready to go over the logistics report before our weekly strategy meeting. Only there was no report, no invite, and no meeting in my calendar. I checked twice, refreshed my inbox. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. People were dressed up. The kind of polished, overly polite energy that comes with high-stakes presentations. A few folks from sales were nervously straightening their ties. Even Brianna from R&D had swapped her hoodies for a blazer. Something was happening, and clearly, I hadn't gotten the memo. I walked past the main conference room just as the glass doors were closing. Inside, Kendry stood at the head of a table, gesturing at a slide deck. A dozen department heads were seated around her. At my usual spot, third seat from the left, was a man I didn't recognize. Late 20s, sharp suit, slicked hair, not a wrinkle in sight. I stopped mid-step. One of the junior analysts, Owen, caught my eye through the glass. His face froze like a kid caught sneaking snacks before dinner. He quickly looked down. I didn't barge in. I didn't knock. I just stood there for a few seconds, watching from the outside like a stranger. Then I turned and walked back to my desk, if you could even call it mine anymore. By lunchtime, I'd pieced it together. Someone forwarded me the company's new internal bulletin. A few lines buried halfway down the page made it official. We welcome Darren Elwood as the new Director of Systems Optimization, bringing fresh insight to our operational realignment. Director of Systems Optimization. That was new. That was my role, with a shinier title, fewer years of experience, and zero context for how the system actually worked. Darren Elwood, the guy in my chair. I read the line again, slower this time. Then I read it a third time, just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood.
They didn't demote me.
They didn't fire me. They just replaced me. Quietly. Efficiently. Without ever saying the words. I sat in the break room for a while, staring out the window at the skyline. St. Louis was just waking up from winter. Patches of sunlight tried to break through the clouds, bouncing off the metal edges of downtown buildings. But it didn't warm me. It wasn't the job that hurt. It was the erasure. Like I was being unwritten. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the 6th floor again. I didn't bother with an appointment. The assistant at the desk gave me a hesitant smile, but didn't stop me. Maybe she saw something in my face. Kendry was in her office, typing away at a laptop. She didn't look surprised to see me. "Malcolm," she said evenly. "Everything okay?" "You tell me," I said. Was there a reason no one thought I needed to be informed that someone else is now doing my job? She didn't flinch. "We're restructuring. You knew that." I didn't know it meant being erased. She sighed softly, then gestured for me to sit. I didn't. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's just evolution. You're not essential anymore." There it was. No hesitation. No sugarcoating. I felt something behind my ribs tighten like a cord pulled taut. Not anger exactly. Just something deeper. A mix of humiliation and realization. I'd given over 2 decades to this company. Built systems from scratch. Worked weekends, holidays, red-eye flights across the country. And all it took to become irrelevant was one executive decision and a new face in a tailored suit. Do you hear yourself? I asked. I'm not essential anymore.
Kendry didn't respond.
She looked back at her screen. That, more than anything, told me exactly where I stood. I walked out of her office slower than I'd entered. The assistant looked up, clearly wondering what had been said. I didn't offer her a smile this time. By the time I reached the elevator, something inside me had shifted. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. I realized something I should have known long ago. Loyalty is only worth something when both sides value the same things. And Kendry and we weren't even reading from the same book, let alone on the same page. She valued disruption. Optics. Surface-level strategy, built on borrowed language from leadership books. I valued consistency. Quiet strength. Systems that worked not because they were shiny, but because they were sturdy. And, in her world, that made me disposable. Back at my makeshift desk, I sat down and opened my notebook. Not my laptop. Just the old-school leather-bound one I kept for things that mattered. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote 5 words. They want the name, not the roots. Then I closed it, folded my hands, and stared out the window. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel the pressure building. A little after 9 a.m., I was hunched over my notepad, sketching out the old supply chain flow from memory. Not because I had to, but because I needed to prove to myself that I still knew it better than anyone else. 2 decades of experience didn't disappear just because someone moved your name off a door. That's when Luis popped his head in. Luis was one of our senior floor supervisors, sharp, dependable, one of the few left from the old crew. He looked anxious in a way I hadn't seen before. "Hey, Mal," he said, stepping fully into the room. "You got a second?" I nodded and waved him in. He held up a tablet, then flipped it around to show me the interface. "They're trying to run shipment allocation through the new platform, but it's not mapping right. The 3rd-tier dispatch isn't syncing with regional carriers. We've got 3 pallets sitting idle in Kansas City, and no one's sure if they're flagged for internal or outbound." I leaned in, scanned the layout. They'd changed everything, icons, labels, even the logic chain. But the bones were still mine. "They pulled a 3-tier matrix?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Luis nodded, said it was outdated. Now they're realizing it held everything together. I opened my mouth to explain, to walk him through the workaround, but then I stopped. Right there, mid-sentence. Because something hit me in that moment, hard and clear. They still needed me. The system still leaned on what I built. But they didn't respect me. They didn't even consult me when they tore out the foundation. Now they were flailing, hoping I'd step in and save them. Luis noticed my hesitation. "Look, I'm not trying to drag you into a mess. I just figured, if anyone could help." I gave a faint nod. "No, I get it." He left, and I sat there staring at the spot where he'd stood. The loyalty was still there in the system, in the staff who remembered how things were built. But leadership? The folks making the calls? They weren't looking for roots. They were decorating branches. I leaned back in my chair, let out a breath, and looked up at the ceiling. The cheap tile squares above seemed to pulse with a buzz of fluorescent light, like even the building was restless. That afternoon, I took a long walk. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. Just picked up my coat and left. A man can only sit in silence so long before it becomes a kind of noise. I ended up near Grace Ridge Chapel. Small brick building tucked between a pharmacy and a laundromat. Nothing fancy. Just a wooden door, a faded cross above the entrance, and warm light bleeding out from stained glass windows. I didn't go in. I never did, not anymore. But I stood outside for a while. Just stood there, watching shadows move behind the glass. A memory came back to me. One of the first years I worked at Sloanwell. We were in the middle of a product failure. A bad batch had gotten through QA, and we were days from a recall. Mr. Sloan called me into his office, closed the door, and said, "Malcolm, would you pray with me?" He wasn't religious. Neither was I, really. But we bowed our heads together and said a few honest words, asking for clarity, not rescue, just clarity. I'd never forgotten that moment. And now, 2 decades later, I stood outside a church, needing the same thing. Clarity. Because staying meant keeping the system alive, sure, but at the cost of erasing who I was. Leaving meant losing the work I loved, but maybe keeping the part of me that still had a spine. As I turned to head back, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Elias. "You free for coffee?" 15 minutes later, we were back at our regular table. He didn't waste time. "You look like a man who's just been asked to fix a ship that already sank." I laughed under my breath. "They want help, but not honesty."
"Of course not," he said.
"They want your skills, not your standards." I nodded, slowly. "I'm thinking of putting in my notice." Elias didn't blink. Good. Good. I raised an eyebrow. He set his coffee down. "Mal, the measure of a man isn't how long he stays in one place. It's whether he knows when to walk away, with his dignity intact." I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been clawing at me for days. What if they use me one last time before I go? What if I stay just long enough to help them patch the hole, and then they toss me aside anyway? He smiled, not unkindly, but with the kind of sympathy that only comes from having been there. "Then you're not walking out. You're being escorted."
I didn't want that.
Not for me. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't waiting to be pushed. I was going to leave on my own feet, on my own terms. While I still remembered why this place had once mattered to me, because even if they forgot, I hadn't. I didn't show up to work on Thursday. No email. No formal request. I just didn't go. I woke up, stared at the ceiling, and thought, if I walk back in there today, I'm not sure I'll recognize the place, or myself. I didn't feel like pretending anymore. So I made coffee, sat on the back porch with a flannel blanket and the sound of birds that didn't care whether I was essential or not. No one called. The quiet was loud, but it wasn't empty. It felt earned. When I came back Friday morning, I barely got through the front door before I knew something was wrong. People were pacing the hallway. Phones were ringing with that urgent tone you only hear when someone's covering up a mistake. 2 interns were printing spreadsheets like their lives depended on it. I caught snippets of conversation. Kansas City drop site, wrong serial batch, surgical procedure rescheduled. I stepped into the logistics bullpen and it was chaos. Luis was red in the face, flipping through digital manifests on 3 screens at once. He looked up, saw me, and let out a breath like he'd been holding it since dawn. "Oh, thank God," he said. "Mal, we've got a serious problem." I raised an eyebrow. One of our biggest hospital clients got the wrong units. The tags didn't match the expected batch numbers. They almost used them before catching it. That landed like a punch. We'd spent years building trust with those clients, especially surgical partners. A screw-up at that level wasn't just costly, it was dangerous. I walked to the nearest terminal. "Show me the chain of custody." Luis pulled it up. I traced the digital path with my finger, then stopped cold.
"Wait.
"These aren't linked to internal clearance codes." He nodded. "That's what we don't get. The platform flagged them as cleared, but skipped the second-tier verification." I sat back. That was the checkpoint I'd built into the system years ago. A safeguard. A friction point on purpose, to stop this exact thing. But it wasn't there anymore. "They removed the anchor," I said aloud. "God help us, they pulled the whole floor out and expected it to float." Luis didn't respond. He didn't need to. That safeguard wasn't flashy. It didn't look good on slide decks. But it worked. And someone, probably Kendry or her bright-eyed consultants, had decided it was legacy clutter. I stood there for a moment, heart sinking. Then I said what I knew I had to. "Call the warehouse. Freeze all pending outbound orders. Every last one." Luis blinked. "You sure?" "They won't like it. But they'll like a lawsuit even less." He nodded and got to work. An hour later, Kendry called. She didn't start with hello. "I hear you halted shipments," she said. "That's right. You're not in a position to make that call anymore." "Funny," I said. "Neither are you if you didn't know your new platform was bypassing safety checks." Silence. She breathed in sharply. "Malcolm, I need your help. Just walk me through what's happening." There it was. The pivot. The ask. I didn't gloat. I didn't get snide. I just sat down and told her the truth. I'll explain what I can. But let's be clear, I'm not doing this to win my title back. I'm not doing it to keep a seat at your table. Then why? Because there are patients on the other end of those boxes. And I can't sit back while they pay the price for someone else's pride. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, tell me what you know." I walked her through it, step by step. The logic that held it all together. The history behind the redundancies. The reasons why invisible work mattered. But I didn't offer to rebuild it. I didn't volunteer to stay. When the call ended, I opened a new file on my personal drive. I started listing every critical function I'd ever touched. Every overlooked safeguard. Every back-end patch that had kept Sloanwell from falling apart under its own weight. I didn't fix anything. I just laid bare the consequences of removing the bones. And as I typed, I felt something loosen inside me, like I was finally exhaling after months of holding it in. At noon, Luis came by. "Kendry's calling an emergency board meeting," he said. "She's rattled." I looked at him.
Good.
Maybe now they'll listen to silence differently. He paused, then asked, "You coming back Monday?" I shook my head.
No. I've said what I needed to.
From here on, they can decide who they want to be. He gave a small nod and left. Monday morning came with a summons. An all-hands meeting, 6th floor. Executive suite. Mandatory attendance. The subject line read Leadership Alignment Session, which was just corporate speak for something went wrong and we're trying to look calm about it. I arrived on time, as always. But for once, I wasn't early. I took the stairs, not the elevator. Slower, steadier. When I walked into the room, Kendry was already seated at the head of the table. No clipboard this time. No blazer. Just a silk blouse and tired eyes. The kind of tired you don't get from staying up late. You get it from realizing you're in over your head and still too proud to say it out loud. She gestured toward the open seat across from her. "Malcolm, thanks for joining." I sat, keeping my back straight and my hands folded. Around us, a half-circle of department heads avoided eye contact. Some tapped pens. Others sipped coffee they probably didn't taste. Kendry cleared her throat. "We're in a tough position right now, and I'll be blunt. We need operational stability. What happened last week shouldn't have happened. And we all know that if Malcolm hadn't stepped in when he did, it could have been a lot worse." The room stayed quiet. She looked directly at me then, and for a moment, I saw something almost human behind the rehearsed posture. Something uncertain. "That's why," she continued, "I'm asking if you'd be willing to take on a temporary leadership role to oversee this transition. No strings. Full autonomy. You'd report directly to me. We just need someone who understands the system and the people." I didn't answer right away. Not because I was caught off guard, but because I'd been expecting this. When silence stretched, she added more gently, "I know we haven't seen eye to eye, but I believe this company still needs your voice." I gave her a long, level look. Then I spoke, slowly, so no one would mistake my tone for bitterness. "Clarissa," I said, using her first name on purpose, "I don't need a title to be a person of value. But I also don't need to keep showing up in a place that stopped seeing me as one." She blinked, like she'd just heard something in a language she hadn't learned yet. I stood up. "I appreciate the offer. I really do. But you don't get to ignore someone's worth and then ask them to clean up the mess afterward." Across the room, I saw a few faces shift. One of the mid-level managers, Ethan, quiet guy from compliance, spoke up. "We always thought you'd stay silent, Malcolm. That maybe you were just tired of pushing back." I turned to him. "I used to think that too," I said. "Until I realized silence isn't the same as peace. And pretending to keep the peace doesn't fix broken systems. It just lets them rot quieter." Another manager nodded slightly. Someone else folded their arms and leaned back. Something in the room changed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Kendry's voice came back, this time thinner. "So, that's a no?" I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the envelope. "Letter of resignation," I said, handing it to her. "Not because you're asking me to leave. but because I've already decided who I want to be when I walk out of here." She took it without another word. As I turned to leave, no one tried to stop me. No polite clapping. No sudden standing ovation. Just the quiet weight of a room where someone finally said what needed to be said. And I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Because for the first time in a long while, I had nothing left to prove. Not to her. Not to them. Not even to myself. I came in early that day, not to beat traffic, not to prove a point. There was no meeting waiting, no call scheduled, no spreadsheet left open. I didn't need to log hours or swipe a badge anymore. I came back for the last time with a simple purpose: to gather what little was mine and walk out like a man who still knew his worth. The office was quiet, like it used to be before the company got too big for its own skin. The lobby smelled faintly of the carpet cleaner they used every weekend. Same security desk. Same faint hum from the elevator shaft. And yet, everything felt different. I rode the elevator alone, eyes on the little flickering floor numbers. 6th floor. My floor. The cubicles were mostly empty, just a few early birds and the cleaning crew. A woman in her 60s, headphones in, was vacuuming the far corner. She looked up when I passed and gave me a small, polite wave. I nodded back. She didn't know my name, but I liked that she acknowledged me. Lately, that was more than I could say for some of the people who shared my last dozen meetings. I walked to my old desk. Well, the one they reassigned to me in the back hall. The drawers were already half cleaned out. I grabbed the last few things that mattered. A hardbound notebook with the leather wearing off the corners. A framed photo of my daughter at 12, squinting in the sun with her braces and a Sloan well-hard hat slipping down over her ears. 2 books I always kept close, one on systems theory, the other on servant leadership. Both with my notes scrawled in the margins. A gear-shaped paperweight my team gave me 5 years ago, engraved with the words, "Keeps us turning." That one I held longer than the others. Halfway through the packing, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn. I knew who it was. Kendry Sloan. No entourage. No iPad. No assistants buzzing behind her like bees. Just her. We stood in silence for a few moments, her on one side of the aisle, me on the other. Then she asked quietly, "Do you think walking away makes you righteous?" There was no heat in her voice. No sarcasm. It wasn't even defensive. She just sounded confused. I turned and looked her in the eye. "No," I said, calm and clear. But staying, knowing I was only being tolerated, that would have made me a coward. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. I could tell she wasn't used to hearing that kind of answer. "You could have stayed," she said. "Helped fix what's broken." I shook my head slowly. "You broke something you didn't understand," I said. "And you replaced people with processes. Not systems, not strategy, people. You thought loyalty was a flaw. That experience was dead weight." She looked down for a second. Her fingers curled slightly at her side, like she wanted to respond but didn't know where to start. I bent down, grabbed the last item from the desk. That old notebook. Notes in every margin, ink faded from years of thinking through crises, deadlines, and late-night work that no one saw. I zipped up my bag, slung it over my shoulder. "This place used to feel like something we were building together," I said. "Now it feels like a hallway everyone's trying to survive until they can jump ship or disappear." Still nothing. No denial. No apology. And maybe that silence was the closest she could come to honesty. I didn't drag it out. I turned, walked down the corridor for the last time, and past the front desk where Greg, the security guard, sat with his crossword puzzle and his usual thermos of gas station coffee. He looked up and smiled like he'd been waiting. "Mr. Malcolm," he said, "if you come back this way sometime, you better stop in and have a coffee with me." I smiled back. "You got it, Greg. But next time, I won't be wearing a name badge." He chuckled and tipped his head. Even better. Outside, the early spring sun had finally pushed through the clouds. The sidewalk was still damp from the morning dew, but the breeze felt warmer than it had in weeks. I stood at the top step for just a second. Not to look back. God knows there wasn't anything behind me I needed to see again. I just wanted to feel the difference between being dismissed and choosing to leave. Then I stepped forward, back straight, shoulders loose. No regrets. It had been a week since I left. Not stormed out. Not marched off in fury. Just left. Closed the door behind me, took one last breath of that stale office air, and stepped out into something I wasn't used to, quiet. That morning, I sat at Riverlight Beans, same corner table by the window, no laptop, no email alerts. Just me, a cup of black coffee, and the sound of the milk steamer hissing behind the counter. For the first few days, I'd felt aimless. Like my body had stopped moving, but my mind was still pacing the floor of that 6th-level conference room. But today felt different. The stillness didn't press on my chest the way it had before. It gave me room to sit in my own skin. Elias slid into the seat across from me like he always did. No hello, no ceremony, just that old rhythm of comfort between two men who didn't need to fill space with noise. We didn't talk about Sloanwell. Not at first. Just the weather. Baseball. The coffee roast being a little stronger than last week. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded flyer. "Got something for you," he said. I took it and read the header. Mid-State Small Business Initiative Mentorship Program. He leaned forward a little. It's mostly mom-and-pop shops. Early stage. Good people trying to figure out how to grow without losing who they are. I raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to?" "They don't need consultants," he said. "They need folks who know what happens when your values get pushed to the edge. People who've lived through the noise and came out still believing in steady hands." I looked down at the flyer. It was simple. Not corporate polished. Just real. For the first time in a long while, the idea of work didn't make me feel tense. "You in?" Elias asked, smiling just enough to show he already knew the answer. "I'll think about it," I said. "But yeah, maybe it's time I put my hands to something that still has a heartbeat." Just then, my phone buzzed. Personal line. Not the work one I'd shut down. It was a message from an old colleague at Sloanwell. "Kendry officially stepped down yesterday. Board's looking for someone with operational maturity." You were right. She wasn't ready. I stared at the screen for a moment. Not out of satisfaction. Just quiet recognition. Then I locked the phone and slipped it into my pocket. Elias caught my expression. "Bad news." I shook my head. "Just news." We sat a moment longer. The silence between us not awkward, just reflective. "I used to think silence was a kind of grace," I said quietly. "But I stayed quiet so long, I forgot that true value isn't measured by how much you can endure. It's by knowing when to stop letting people confuse your humility with invisibility." Elias nodded, slow and steady. "Then I'd say you learned the lesson most folks never do," he said. After coffee, I walked back toward my neighborhood. The air had that early spring feel, soft sun, a little chill hiding in the wind. I found myself standing outside Grace Ridge Chapel again. This time, I went in. No one noticed. Just a few elderly folks scattered across the pews, the kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. I took a seat in the back. No big thoughts, no grand prayers. Just a moment to be still and breathe where it was safe to lay down everything I'd been holding. I didn't ask for answers. I didn't need any. I just closed my eyes and whispered, somewhere deep in myself, "I don't need to stand firm in a company, as long as I can stand firm in who I am." When I stepped outside, the sun had dropped lower in the sky. Light brushed the tops of the trees, casting everything in that soft, gold hue that makes even parking lots look holy. Near the sidewalk, a group of college students were handing out flyers. One of them smiled and held one toward me. "Sir, would you be interested in attending a workshop on career and character?" I smiled back, not out of politeness, but out of something closer to peace. "No thanks," I said. "I don't need another lesson." I nodded once, gently. I just lived the most important one of my life. Before we end, I just want to say this. I didn't tell this story to prove anything. I told it because maybe, just maybe, someone out there knows what it's like to give your heart to a place and feel it walk away from you without a word. Maybe you've sat in the same silence I did. Maybe you've questioned whether your worth depends on staying quiet or standing up. If you've ever carried that kind of weight, I hope this story reminded you that you're not alone. That dignity isn't something anyone else gets to give or take from you. It's something you hold quietly until you're ready to walk out with your back straight. Have you ever had to choose between peace and self-respect? I'd really like to hear how you faced it. And if this story found a soft place in you, I hope you'll stay for the next one.